The rain had been falling all afternoon, a steady gray curtain over the city that turned the streets into long, shimmering mirrors. Inside Le Clair de Lune, though, the world felt sealed off from all that, quiet, warm, and wrapped in soft golden light. The piano bar sat tucked between a luxury watch boutique and a tailor who charged more for a pair of cuffs than most people made in a week. It wasn't the kind of place you stumbled into by accident. You came here because you belonged, or because you were trying very hard to look like you did. At first glance, the room seemed frozen in time, dark wood paneling, leather banquettes worn just enough to feel lived in, crystal glasses that caught the light like tiny stars. A grand piano stood near the center, its polished black surface gleaming under a single spotlight. Every night at exactly 7:15 p.m., the house pianist would take his seat, adjust his cuffs, and begin playing. Always something elegant, always something familiar. Chopin, Debussy, maybe a little Gershwin if the mood felt playful. The music wasn't meant to overwhelm. It was background like fine perfume, present but never demanding attention. And then there was her. She moved through the room like someone who'd learned long ago how to disappear. Not because she wanted to, but because it was easier that way. She wore the same uniform as the other servers. Black slacks, white blouse, a thin silver name tag pinned just above her heart. But on her, it looked less like a costume and more like armor. Her hair was pulled back in a simple bun, not a strand out of place. Her steps were quiet, measured, never rushing even when the orders piled up. She knew how to glide between tables without disturbing a single conversation, how to refill a water glass without making a sound, how to read a guest's mood from the angle of their shoulders. Most of the regulars never really saw her. They'd nod absently when she approached, mumble their drink orders without looking up, leave a tip that was generous but impersonal, like tossing a coin into a fountain for good luck. To them, she was part of the scenery, as essential and unnoticed as the ice in their whiskey or the linen on their laps. But if they'd paid closer attention, if they'd watched her when she thought no one was looking, they might have noticed something strange. Every night, without fail, she'd pause for just a second near the piano during her rounds. Not long enough to be obvious. Just a breath, a flicker of her eyes toward the keys, a slight tightening in her jaw like she was holding something back. The truth was, she heard every note, not just the notes the pianist played, but the ones he missed. The rushed arpeggio in the left hand, the slight hesitation before the key change, the way he sometimes played safe, choosing showy runs over emotional depth. She didn't judge him for it. She understood. Playing for a room full of people who barely listened was its own kind of performance, one that required stamina more than soul. But oh, how she remembered what it felt like to play with soul. Years ago, before the hospital bills, before the eviction notice, before the long bus rides across town with a backpack full of sheet music and a heart full of hope, she'd sat at a piano just like this one. Not in a bar, but in a sunlit practice room with tall windows and a view of cherry blossoms. Back then, her fingers didn't carry trays. They danced. She'd spent hours shaping phrases, chasing the exact shade of melancholy in a Chopin nocturne, or the precise sparkle in a listitude. Teachers had called her gifted, even said she had the hands of a poet. She'd believed them, until life reminded her that talent alone doesn't pay rent. She'd been close, so close to finishing her degree at one of the most respected music schools in the country. Then her mother got sick. Really sick. The kind of sick that empties bank accounts and rewrites futures. She dropped out without ceremony, packed her few belongings, and took the first job she could find. Waiting tables wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and it kept the lights on. Now at 28, she'd built a quiet life around survival. She lived in a small apartment above a laundromat in Queens where the hum of dryers was her lullaby. She took the subway an hour each way to work, always with noise-canceling headphones, but not to block out the world. To fill it with music. She'd listen to recordings of Glenn Gould, of Martha Argerich, of old radio broadcasts from the 1950s, studying every breath, every pause, every imperfection that made the performance human. And on Tuesday and Thursday nights, when the church down the street let her use their old upright piano after choir practice, she'd sit in the empty sanctuary and play until her fingers ached. No audience, no applause. Just her, the wood, and the memory of who she used to be. Back at Le Clair de Lune, the evening unfolded as it always did, A group of men in tailored suits debated stock options over single malt scotch. A woman in a silk dress laughed too loudly at something her date said, though her eyes stayed distant. Near the window, an older couple held hands across the table, silent but connected in a way that needed no words. The pianist played a smooth rendition of Clair de Lune. Ironic, given the bar's name and the room's sighed in collective approval. She moved among them, balancing 3 cocktails on a tray, smiling politely when spoken to, vanishing the moment she wasn't needed. But inside, a different kind of performance was always playing out. She'd hear a phrase from the piano and instantly imagine how she'd shape it, softer here, slower there, with more space between the notes. She'd picture her own hands on the keys, the weight of her touch, the way the pedal could blur sorrow into something beautiful. It wasn't jealousy she felt, not exactly. More like longing, the kind that lives in your bones. Once, early in her time at the bar, she'd made the mistake of humming along to a melody while clearing a table. The guest, a woman with sharp cheekbones and sharper eyes, had looked up and said, "Do you play?" She'd frozen, then shaken her head quickly. "No, just, I like music." The woman had smiled, but it was the kind of smile that said, "Of course you don't. People like you don't belong at the piano." She never hummed again. Still, she kept listening, kept practicing in secret, kept dreaming in minor keys. Tonight, as the rain tapped gently against the windows, something felt different. Not in the room, in her. Maybe it was the way the pianist's playing felt especially mechanical, like he was going through the motions. Maybe it was the memory of last night's practice session, where she'd finally cracked a passage in Rachmaninoff that had haunted her for weeks. Or maybe it was just the weight of all those years of silence finally pressing too hard. She set down an empty tray in the kitchen, wiped her hands on a towel, and glanced toward the piano. The pianist was taking a break, sipping water near the service door. The keys sat empty, waiting. For a wild, impossible second, she imagined walking over there, sitting down, letting her fingers speak for the first time in years in front of real people. Then she laughed at herself, quietly under her breath, and turned back to her station. "Don't be foolish," she thought. "You're a waitress. That's your role. Stick to it." But deep down, beneath the practicality and the fear and the years of playing small, a tiny spark refused to go out. Because music doesn't die just because no one hears it. It waits, it breathes, it remembers, and sometimes when the world is quiet enough, it finds its way back. The Thursday night shift always felt heavier than the others. Maybe it was because everyone was already thinking about the weekend, their minds half-packed for escape, their patience thinner, or maybe it was just the way the air hung in the room, stale from too many perfumes, too much money, too many conversations that meant nothing. She'd learned to move through it like water, adapting to every shape, never resisting, never spilling. She'd just finished clearing a table near the back, 3 empty wine glasses, a half-eaten cheese plate, a crumpled napkin with lipstick smudged on the edge, when she heard the manager's voice crack through the low hum of the room. He was standing near the bar, phone pressed to his ear, his face tight with the kind of stress that only comes when something important is about to go wrong. "No, I understand," he was saying, voice low but urgent. "But you can't just not show up. It's 7 o'clock. The room is full. People are expecting—" He stopped, listened for a moment, then let out a sharp breath. "Fine, yeah, thanks for nothing." He hung up and stood there for a second, staring at the piano like it had personally betrayed him. She knew that look. It was the same one he'd worn last winter when the ice machine broke during a private event for a celebrity chef. Panic disguised as irritation. She didn't mean to eavesdrop, but she was close enough to catch the muttered words as he turned to the head bartender. "He's got food poisoning. Says he can't even stand up. What am I supposed to do? We can't have dead air in there. These people pay to hear music, not silence." The bartender shrugged. "Call a sub?" "We don't have a sub on call for tonight. Everyone's booked. And even if we did, who's going to drive across town in this rain for a last-minute gig at a place like this? They'd want double pay, and I don't have approval for that." She kept wiping down her tray, pretending not to listen, but her mind was already racing. She knew every pianist in the city who took bar gigs. Most of them were friends from school or at least acquaintances. But none of them would drop everything on a Thursday night in the rain. Not for this place, not unless they were desperate. And then, without really deciding to, she spoke. "I can play." The words came out softer than she intended, almost lost in the clink of glasses behind the bar. But the manager turned. So did the bartender. Both stared at her like she'd just announced she could fly. "You?" the manager said, eyebrows lifting. "You play piano?" She nodded once, keeping her eyes on the tray in her hands. "A little. A little?" He let out a dry laugh. "This isn't a recital at your aunt's house. This is Leclerc de Lune. People come here because they expect a certain standard. They expect polish, I know," she said quietly. "I studied. For a long time." He studied her back, really looked at her, maybe for the first time since she'd been hired. She could see the doubt warring with desperation in his eyes. On one hand, she was just a waitress. On the other, the piano sat empty and the room was starting to notice. A few guests had glanced toward it, then back at their drinks, waiting for the music to return. One of the regulars, a man who always sat in the corner booth with a tumbler of bourbon and a leather-bound notebook, cleared his throat. "Is there a problem?" he asked, not unkindly. "No, sir," the manager said quickly. "Just a small delay. Our pianist is indisposed." The man nodded, but his eyes flicked to the silent piano, then to her. She felt exposed, like a secret had been pulled into the light before she was ready. Back in the kitchen, the other servers had gathered near the pass, whispering. She heard one of them say, "Did she really just offer to play?" Another laughed. "Yeah, right. Next she'll say she used to conduct the New York Philharmonic." She ignored them. She was used to being underestimated. In fact, she'd come to rely on it. It kept expectations low, which made survival easier. But this was different. She took a breath and looked the manager in the eye. "Just let me play one piece. If it's not up to standard, if anyone complains, if you think it's not good enough, I'll walk away. No questions. You can tell everyone I was just filling in while you found someone else." He hesitated. She could see the calculation in his face, the risk of embarrassment versus the risk of silence. In a place like this, silence was worse. Silence meant something was broken, and broken things made people uncomfortable. "Fine," he said finally, voice tight. "One piece. Something simple. Nothing flashy. And if I say stop, you stop," she nodded. Understood. She didn't rush. She walked calmly to the staff closet, took off her apron, folded it neatly, and tucked it onto a shelf. Then she smoothed her blouse, ran a hand over her hair to make sure it was still in place, and walked toward the piano. The room didn't go quiet, not at first. People were still talking, laughing, clinking ice in their glasses. But as she approached the grand piano, something shifted. Conversation slowed. Heads turned. A few guests exchanged puzzled glances. Who was this? Why was the waitress heading for the piano? She didn't look at them. She kept her gaze fixed on the bench. She sat down, adjusted it slightly, just like she'd done 1,000 times before, and placed her hands lightly on the keys. The wood was cool under her fingertips. Familiar. Right. For a second she closed her eyes, not to pray, just to remember. She thought of the church basement, the flickering fluorescent light, the way the old upright groaned when she hit the low notes. She thought of her mother, sitting in a hospital chair, eyes closed, smiling as she played a simple lullaby on a keyboard balanced on her lap. She thought of all the times she'd wanted to play in front of people but held back out of fear, out of shame, out of the belief that her time had passed. But this wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't about fame or revenge or even being seen. It was about sound, about truth, about letting the music speak when words had failed her for too long. She opened her eyes and she began. She chose Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Not because it was easy, far from it, but because it was honest. It wasn't a showpiece. It didn't demand technical fireworks. It asked for feeling, for space, for the kind of quiet courage that comes from vulnerability. Her fingers found the opening notes without hesitation, soft, flowing, like moonlight spilling across still water. The left hand rolled gently beneath, a steady heartbeat. The right hand sang. At first, only a few people noticed. A woman near the front stopped mid-sentence. A man setting down his fork froze with it halfway to his plate. Then slowly, like ripples spreading from a single drop, the entire room fell into silence. The chatter died. The clinking stopped. Even the ice in the glasses seemed to hold its breath. She didn't look up. She couldn't. She was inside the music now, wrapped in it, carried by it. Every note was a memory, a hope, a wound turned into sound. She played the melody with a tenderness that surprised even her, like she was cradling something fragile. And when the harmony deepened, when the chords grew richer and more complex, she let the emotion rise, not too much, just enough to make the heart ache. In the back, the manager stood frozen, arms crossed, eyes wide. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. Maybe a clumsy rendition of For Elise. Maybe a nervous stumble through a pop song. But this was something else entirely. This was the kind of playing he'd heard on recordings, not in a bar on a rainy Thursday night from someone who'd been serving him coffee that morning. Near the window, the older couple held hands tighter. The woman had tears in her eyes, though she didn't wipe them away. The man just stared at the piano, his expression unreadable, but his knuckles were white. At the bar, the head bartender stopped polishing glasses. He just stood there, towel in hand, listening. Even the kitchen staff had come to the doorway, peeking out like kids at a school play. One of them whispered, "Is that really her?" She reached the middle section, the part where the music swells, where longing turns to quiet defiance. Her fingers moved with a confidence that hadn't been there in years. Not because she'd practiced this exact passage 1,000 times, though she had, but because she finally believed she deserved to play it. And then, just as gently as it began, the piece came to its close. The final chords hung in the air like smoke, soft, lingering, full of unspoken things. She lifted her hands from the keys. Silence. Not the awkward kind. Not the kind that follows a mistake. This was a different silence, reverent, stunned. Then from the corner booth, the man with the bourbon stood up. He didn't clap loudly or dramatically. Just a slow, steady beat of his hands, once, twice. That was all it took. The room erupted. Not in wild cheering, this wasn't a rock concert, but in warm, genuine applause. People rose to their feet. Some wiped their eyes. Others just smiled, shaking their heads in disbelief. A woman near the front said, "I had no idea." The manager stood there, stunned. He looked at her, not as a waitress, not as staff, but as someone he'd completely misjudged. He walked over slowly, hands in his pockets, and said, That was incredible." She nodded, still a little breathless. "Thank you. You studied where?" he asked, voice hushed. She almost didn't answer. But then she thought, why hide it now? "At Juilliard. For 3 years," his eyes widened. "And you've been serving here?" "I needed a job," she said simply. No bitterness, no drama. Just fact. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Well, I guess I owe you an apology." She shook her head. "You didn't know." "No," he admitted. "But I should have listened." Just then, the man from the corner booth approached. He was older, with silver hair and a calm presence that filled the space around him. He didn't introduce himself. Didn't ask for her name. He just said, "You play like someone who's lived." She didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded. He smiled faintly. "Don't stop." Then he turned and walked back to his table, leaving her standing there, heart pounding, hands still tingling from the keys. The manager cleared his throat. "So and what now?" She looked at the piano, at the room, at all the faces watching her with new eyes. "I'll finish my shift," she said. "But if you need someone to play, I'm here." He nodded slowly. Yeah, I think we'll take you up on that." As she walked back to the kitchen to get her apron, the whispers followed her, not mocking this time, but full of wonder. The other servers looked at her differently, not with jealousy, but with something like awe. She tied the apron back on, picked up her tray, and returned to the floor. But everything had changed. Not because she'd played a piece of music, but because, for the first time in a long time, she hadn't hidden who she was, and the room, once so cold, so polished, so full of people pretending, had finally heard her. The silence after the last note didn't last long, but it felt like forever. In that suspended moment, the whole room seemed to hold its breath, as if afraid that moving or speaking might break the spell. Then came the applause. Not the polite, scattered kind people give when they're just being nice, but something deeper, real. People stood up. Not all of them, but enough. A few wiped their eyes without embarrassment. Others just sat there, staring at the piano like they'd seen a ghost, or maybe for the first time, something truly alive. She stayed seated for a few seconds, hands resting lightly on the keys, not moving, not looking up. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but not from nerves. It was something else, like a door inside her had swung open after years of rusted hinges, and light was finally pouring through. She took a slow breath, let it out, and stood. It started with a guest recording a 30-second clip on their phone, just the opening of her original piece, the one with no name. They posted it online with the caption, "Waitress sits down at the piano in a fancy NYC bar." What happens next stunned everyone. Within hours, it had thousands of views. By morning, it was trending locally. By the end of the week, it had 500,000. Suddenly, her quiet return to music wasn't so quiet anymore. Messages poured in. A morning talk show wanted her on. A local arts magazine asked for an interview. A nonprofit that supported working artists offered a small grant to help her reconnect with her craft. She read each message carefully, heart pounding, but didn't reply right away. She'd seen how fast the internet could turn wonder into spectacle. How quickly a person could become a meme instead of a musician. She talked it over with the manager one slow Tuesday afternoon, while they both sipped coffee in the empty bar. "You don't have to say yes to any of it," he told her. "You're not obligated to become famous just because someone filmed you." "I know," she said. "But what if this is my only chance?" He looked at her for a long moment. "It's not your only chance. It's your first chance. There will be others if you stay true to why you play." That stuck with her. She declined the talk show. Too flashy, too much like a performance of herself rather than her music. But she said yes to the magazine interview. On one condition, they wouldn't use the word waitress in the headline. "I serve tables," she told the editor gently. "But I'm a pianist. That's who I am." The article came out a week later. It was thoughtful, respectful. It talked about her training, her years away from the instrument, her return not as a gimmick but as a quiet act of courage. It included a short audio clip of her playing. Readers wrote in saying they cried. One letter simply said, "Thank you for reminding me that beauty still exists in ordinary places." Then came the offer that surprised her most. A man walked into the bar one Thursday night. Not a regular, not someone dressed for the scene. He wore a worn corduroy jacket and carried a briefcase that looked older than he was. He sat at a corner table, ordered tea, and listened to her entire set without moving. Afterward, he waited until the room had mostly cleared, then approached. "I used to teach at Juilliard," he said quietly. "Years ago, before I retired." She recognized him then, not by name but by the way he held himself, the calm certainty in his posture. She'd seen him once long ago, giving a master class she'd snuck into as a first-year student. "I remember you," she said softly. He smiled. "I remember you too. You played Liszt that day. You were nervous, but your hands never lied." They sat together for a while, talking not about fame or opportunities, but about music, about phrasing, about silence, about how hard it is to play simply. Before he left, he handed her a folded piece of paper. "My old studio is empty most afternoons," he said. "If you ever want to practice on a real piano, it's yours." She didn't cry, but her throat tightened in a way that felt like gratitude. With that small gift, her routine changed again. On her days off, she'd take the train to the Upper West Side, climb 3 flights of stairs to a sunlit room filled with sheet music and the scent of old wood, and play for hours. No audience, no expectations, just her and the instrument, rebuilding the connection note by note. Back at the bar, she began weaving more of her own compositions into her sets. Short pieces mostly, fragments of feeling shaped into sound. One was called Subway Lullaby, built from the rhythm of train wheels and the hum of fluorescent lights. Another, Tips and Tremolos, played with a gentle irony that made the regulars smile. People started asking for them by name. One evening, during a quiet moment between sets, an older man she'd never seen before sat at the bar. He ordered a soda, unusual in a place full of whiskey drinkers, and watched her with kind eyes. When she passed by, he said, "You remind me of my wife. She played piano. Not professionally. Just for joy." She paused. "What happened to her?" "She's gone now," he said simply. "But when I hear you play, it's like she's still here, just in a different key." She didn't know what to say, so she just nodded. But later, during her second set, she played a piece her mother used to love, a simple folk melody from their hometown, rearranged for piano. She played it slowly, tenderly, like a letter sent across time. When she finished, she looked toward the bar. The man was gone, but his soda glass sat empty, and on the napkin beside it was a folded check. She didn't open it until after her shift. It was for $5,000, no note. Just her name written neatly in the corner. She stared at it for a long time. Not because of the amount, though it was more than she made in 2 months, but because of what it meant. Someone had listened. Really listened. And they'd given not out of pity, but out of shared understanding. She didn't cash it right away. She kept it in her sheet music folder, a quiet reminder that music could still move people in a world that often felt numb. As the weeks turned into months, she made careful choices. She said no to agents who promised big exposure, but wanted her to wear glittery dresses and play pop covers. She turned down a reality show that wanted to document her rise from waitress to star. She knew those paths led to a version of herself she didn't recognize. Instead, she negotiated with the bar. She'd keep her weekday shifts for stability, but her weekend performances would be treated as a proper residency, with fair pay, creative control, and a small sign on the piano that read, "Original compositions performed tonight." The manager agreed without hesitation. "You've brought something real to this place," he told her. "That's worth more than any gimmick." And slowly the crowd at Leclerc de Lune began to change. Yes, the financiers and fashion insiders still came. They liked the new energy, the buzz, but they were joined by music students, retired teachers, couples on modest dates, even a few former classmates who'd lost touch over the years. The room felt warmer now, more human. Conversations were quieter, more thoughtful. People came not just to be seen, but to feel something. One rainy Friday, as she played a quiet improvisation based on the sound of raindrops hitting the window, she looked out and saw a young woman in the back, tears streaming down her face. After the set, the woman approached, trembling slightly. "I lost my brother last month," she whispered. "You played like you knew what grief sounds like." She didn't offer empty words. She just said, "Thank you for listening." That was the thing no one had told her, that playing wasn't just about giving, it was about receiving. Every note she offered came back to her in glances, in silence, in the way strangers sometimes reached for each other's hands during a particularly tender passage. She wasn't famous. She wasn't rich, but she was whole. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was living two lives, one hidden, one seen. She was just herself, a person who served tables and played piano, who carried pain and made beauty from it, who showed up night after night and let her hands speak when words weren't enough. The world outside still moved fast, loud, chaotic. But inside Leclerc de Lune, for a few hours each weekend, time slowed. Hearts opened. And music, real, honest, human music, filled the space between strangers like a quiet promise. You're not alone. The seasons turned, and Leclerc de Lune settled into a new kind of rhythm, one that felt less like a performance and more like a shared breath. The piano wasn't just an instrument anymore. It was a bridge. People came not only for the drinks or the velvet booths, but for the quiet magic that happened when she sat down and let her hands speak. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't loud, but it was real. And in a world that often felt polished to the point of emptiness, real was rare enough to draw crowds. She still wore her uniform on weekdays, still balanced trays with practiced ease, still knew which regular liked their martini with 3 olives and which one always left a $20 tip, even when the service was slow. But something had shifted beneath the surface. She no longer felt like two people, the server and the musician. She was just one person, finally whole, finally allowed to exist in full color. Friday and Saturday nights became something sacred. Not in a religious way, but in the way that silence can be sacred, full of meaning, full of space for people to feel things they'd long forgotten how to name. She'd start with a classical piece, something familiar but played with a tenderness that made it new. Then she'd move into her own compositions, short, wordless stories shaped from years of watching, waiting, and wondering. One night she played a new piece she'd been working on for weeks. She hadn't given it a title yet, but it carried the weight of subway rides at dawn, of hospital waiting rooms, of hope that refused to die even when it had every reason to. When she finished, the room stayed silent for a full 10 seconds. Then someone in the back whispered, "That was everything." After the set, as she was wiping down the piano, an older woman approached. She wore a simple wool coat and carried a handbag that looked like it had seen decades of use. Her eyes were bright, sharp, but kind. She didn't say much at first, just stood there, watching her with a look that felt like recognition. "You played like someone who's loved deeply and lost deeply," the woman finally said. Her voice was soft but steady, and still chose to create. She didn't know how to respond, so she just nodded. "Music helps." "It does," the woman agreed. "But not everyone can turn pain into something that heals others. You did that tonight." Before she could say anything else, the woman reached into her bag, pulled out a folded envelope, and pressed it into her hand. "This isn't charity," she said firmly. "It's an investment. In you, in your music, in the kind of beauty this world desperately needs." Then she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd before she could even thank her. Later, in the quiet of her apartment, she opened the envelope. Inside was a check, larger than any she'd ever held, and a single line written in neat cursive. "Finish what you started." She knew what it meant. Not just the degree, the dream, the life she'd set aside when the world demanded she shrink. The next morning, she called the music school she'd left years ago. She didn't expect them to remember her, but they did. The administrator's voice softened when she said her name. "We always hoped you'd come back," she said. She enrolled in a part-time program designed for returning students. Flexible hours, online theory classes, in-person performance workshops on weekends. It wasn't the same as being 20 and wide-eyed, but it didn't need to be. This time she wasn't chasing approval or perfection. She was coming back for herself. At the bar, her sets grew richer, more confident. She began weaving in pieces she was studying, Brahms, Ravel, even a little Scriabin alongside her own work. The regulars noticed the change. "You sound freer," one told her. "Like you're not holding your breath anymore." She wasn't. For the first time, she played without fear of being found out, without worry that she didn't belong. The piano wasn't a stage, it was home. One evening, as autumn deepened into winter and the city glittered with holiday lights, she premiered a new composition. She'd finally given it a name, Tips and Tremolos. It opened with a playful, rhythmic motif, like coins dropping into a jar, then melted into a lyrical middle section full of longing, before resolving into something warm and hopeful. When she finished, the applause was thunderous, but what stayed with her wasn't the noise. It was the look on people's faces. Not awe, not curiosity. Connection. After the set, the manager handed her a small box. "From the woman in the wool coat," he said. She left it with the hostess. Inside was a vintage metronome, brass, slightly worn, with a soft tick that sounded like a heartbeat. Tucked beneath it was a note. "Time is on your side now. Use it well." She placed the metronome on her piano at home. Every time she practiced, its steady pulse reminded her she wasn't racing against anything anymore. She was simply becoming. Word of her journey spread, but quietly, through word of mouth, through shared moments, through the kind of organic respect that can't be bought or manufactured. A local concert hall invited her to perform a short recital, not as a novelty act, but as a serious artist.
She said yes.
The night of the performance, the room was full, not with industry people or critics, but with regulars from the bar, neighbors from her building, students from the music school, even the retired Juilliard teacher who'd lent her his studio. They came not to gawk, but to bear witness. She played for them not as someone who'd made it, but as someone who'd simply refused to disappear. Back at Leclerc de Lune, the exclusivity remained, the prices, the dress code, the hushed conversations, but the soul of the place had changed. It wasn't just a place for the wealthy to see and be seen. It was a place where strangers sat together in silence and felt less alone, where a man might cry during a nocturne and no one would think less of him, where a young girl might whisper to her mother, "I want to play like her," and mean it with her whole heart. One rainy evening, much like the night it all began, she sat at the piano after her shift had ended. The bar was empty except for the manager who was counting the till and the bartender wiping down the counter. She didn't have to play, but she wanted to. She placed her hands on the keys and played a simple lullaby, the same one she'd played for her mother all those years ago. No audience, no expectations, just sound, memory, and love. When she finished, the manager looked up from his ledger. "You know," he said quietly, This place was just a room before you sat down at that piano. She smiled. It was always more than that. You just needed someone to remind you. He nodded, and for a moment they both understood. She hadn't changed the bar. She'd helped it remember what it could be. In the months that followed, she kept working, serving, studying, playing. She didn't quit her job. She didn't chase fame. She built a life that honored all parts of who she was, and slowly, quietly, the world made space for her. One afternoon, as she walked home from the music school, a young woman stopped her on the street. "Are you the pianist from Leclerc de Lune?" she asked, eyes wide. "I saw the video. It got me through a really hard time." They talked for a few minutes about music, about fear, about how hard it is to keep going when no one's watching. Before they parted, the young woman said, "You gave me hope." She didn't know what to say, so she just smiled and said, "Then we're even." Because that night at the piano, when she'd finally let herself be seen, she hadn't just given something to the room had given something back to her. Permission to exist fully, to create without apology, to believe that her voice mattered. Now, when she played, she didn't think about the crowd or the critics or the past. She thought about the notes, the spaces between them, the way a single chord could hold a lifetime of feeling. And she played, not for approval, not for escape, but because it was who she was. The exclusive crowd that once couldn't believe their sensibilities had long since stopped being surprised. They'd moved past shock into something deeper, trust. They trusted that when she sat at the piano, something true would happen. And in a world full of noise, that kind of truth was worth more than any price tag. She wasn't invisible anymore, but more importantly, she wasn't pretending. And as she walked into Leclerc de Lune each evening, tray in hand, music in her heart, she knew she'd finally found the place where all her pieces fit together. Not because the world had changed, but because she'd stopped hiding from it. The piano waited. The room listened. And she played quietly, bravely, beautifully, exactly as she was meant to. There was no grand finale, no spotlight finale, no standing ovation that lasted for hours, no sudden record deal that changed everything overnight. Life didn't work that way, not really. What came next was quieter, slower, and far more meaningful. The steady unfolding of a life finally lived without apology. Months after that first night at the piano, she still woke before dawn most days. Not because she had to, but because the quiet hours belonged to her, and to the music. She'd make coffee in her small kitchen, wrap herself in a worn sweater, and sit at the old keyboard she'd bought secondhand years ago. It wasn't perfect. The middle C stuck sometimes and the pedal squeaked, but it was hers. And in those early hours before the city stirred, she practiced. Not to impress anyone, not to prove anything, just to stay honest with the notes. She'd enrolled in the music program as promised. Classes were on weekends, theory online during lunch breaks. Her classmates were a mix, young prodigies fresh out of high school, career changers in their 40s, retirees chasing a dream they'd shelved decades ago. No one treated her like a curiosity. They just saw a fellow musician, someone who listened deeply and played with care. During workshops, when she performed, there was no whispering about her past as a waitress. They only talked about phrasing, about intention, about how she made a simple scale feel like a question waiting to be answered. At Leclerc de Lune, her weekend sets had become something of a quiet institution. People planned their evenings around them, not in a flashy ticketed way, but in the way you might plan to visit a favorite park in spring just to feel the light on your face. The bar still served expensive cocktails and catered to a well-heeled crowd, but the air had softened. Conversations leaned toward meaning rather than status. A tech executive once admitted over a glass of bourbon that he came not to network but to remember what silence feels like. She never stopped serving during the week. In fact, she'd come to appreciate the balance. The physicality of carrying trays, the rhythm of clearing tables, the small kindnesses exchanged with regulars. It grounded her. Music could lift you, but work kept you honest. And she liked that duality. She wasn't the pianist who used to wait tables. She was someone who did both and found dignity in each. One evening, during a slow Tuesday shift, a young couple sat near the back. They looked nervous, new to the place, maybe even out of their usual budget. She served them gently without making them feel watched. Later, as she passed their table, she overheard the woman say, I can't believe we're here. This place feels like another world. The man squeezed her hand. We deserve one night like this. Something about that stayed with her. So after her shift ended, instead of heading straight home, she sat at the piano, just for a few minutes, and played a short, tender piece she'd written for nights like this. Full of hope, full of second chances. She didn't announce it, didn't look at them. But when she finished, she saw the woman wipe her eyes and lean into her partner's shoulder. That was enough. Not every night was profound. Some were ordinary. She played, people listened, tips were left, dishes were washed. But even in the ordinary, there was grace. The bartender started leaving sheet music on the bench, pieces he thought she might like. The dishwasher hummed melodies under his breath. Even the doorman, usually stoic, would nod slightly when she walked in on performance nights, as if to say, "Go on. We're ready." Then came the invitation that surprised her most. A community center in the Bronx reached out. They ran a free after-school music program for kids who couldn't afford lessons. Their piano was broken, their teacher had moved away, and they were about to shut it down. Someone had seen her video, read her story, and wondered, would she be willing to come once a week? Just to play, just to show them it's possible. She didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said, "I'll come." The first time she walked into that bright, slightly chaotic room, walls covered in kids' drawings, mismatched chairs, a piano held together with duct tape, she felt something shift inside her. These weren't patrons in silk dresses. They were 10-year-olds with scuffed sneakers and big dreams and questions like, do your fingers ever get tired? And can you play Happy Birthday but like fancy? She played for them. Then she let them try. She showed them how to find middle C, how to make a chord sound warm instead of harsh, how silence between notes could be just as powerful as the notes themselves. One boy, quiet and serious, stayed after everyone else left. "My mom says I'm not good enough for real lessons," he mumbled, eyes on the floor. She knelt beside him. "Who told her that?" "No one. She just thinks music is for rich kids." She placed his small hands on the keys. "Music is for anyone who listens with their heart. You've got that. I can tell." She came back the next week, and the next. She didn't get paid. She brought her own sheet music, her own patience, her own belief, and slowly the program grew. Parents started showing up to listen. A local church donated a better piano. A retired music teacher volunteered to help. What had been on the brink of closing became a little haven, a place where talent wasn't measured by money but by courage. She never told the kids her full story. She didn't need to. They saw her, someone who showed up, who listened, who believed in them. And that was more powerful than any biography. Back in her own life, small miracles kept appearing. The check from the woman in the wool coat covered her tuition for 2 semesters. The retired Juilliard teacher became a quiet mentor, offering guidance without pressure. And the bar, once a place of survival, had become a stage where she could be fully herself without shame. One spring evening, as cherry blossoms drifted past the windows of Leclerc de Lune, she played a new piece. It had no title yet, but it carried the feeling of coming home, not to a place but to a self she'd almost forgotten. Halfway through, she looked up and saw the room wasn't just listening. They were with her. Shoulders relaxed, eyes soft, breathing in time with the music. Afterward, an older man she'd never seen before approached. He didn't speak at first, just handed her a small cloth-bound book. Inside were handwritten sheet music pages, original compositions by his late wife, a pianist who'd played in small halls across Europe before illness took her voice. "She would have loved your playing," he said. "Keep her music alive, and keep yours alive too." She played one of the pieces the following week. It was delicate, full of longing and light. Afterward, 3 people asked where they could find the score. She smiled. "It's not published, but it's real, and that's enough." That became her mantra. Real is enough. She stopped comparing herself to the prodigies on concert stages. She stopped worrying about whether her path was impressive enough. She played because it was true. She served because it was honest. And in that balance, she found a kind of peace that fame could never buy. One afternoon, while walking through the park near her apartment, she saw a street performer, a teenager with a keyboard set up on a blanket, playing a simple melody with fierce concentration. People passed by without stopping, but she did. She stood there for 10 minutes listening. When the teen finished, She dropped a 20 into the open case and said, "You've got something special. Don't stop." The teen's eyes lit up. "Thanks, I needed to hear that." She walked away, heart full. It wasn't about being seen. It was about seeing others and reminding them they mattered. Years ago, she'd believed her story was over when she left music school. That her hands were meant for trays, not keys. But life had a way of circling back, not to fix the past, but to redeem it. Every late shift, every bus ride, every silent practice session in a cold church basement, they hadn't been wasted. They'd been preparation, not for fame, but for this. The quiet joy of creating something true and sharing it without fear. Now when she sat at the piano, she didn't think about the crowd or the critics or the past. She thought about the music, about the spaces between the notes, about the way a single chord could hold a lifetime of feeling. And she played, not for approval, not for escape, but because it was who she was. The exclusive crowd that once couldn't believe their sensibilities had long since stopped being surprised. They'd moved past shock into something deeper, trust. They trusted that when she sat at the piano, something real would happen. And in a world full of noise, that kind of truth was worth more than any price tag. She wasn't invisible anymore. But more importantly, she wasn't pretending. And as she walked into Leclerc de Lune each evening, tray in hand, music in her heart, she knew she'd finally found the place where all her pieces fit together. Not because the world had changed, but because she'd stopped hiding from it. The piano waited. The room listened. And she played quietly, bravely, beautifully, exactly as she was meant to. Not as a spectacle, not as a story, but as a person, whole and human, offering the only thing she truly had to give. Her truth, one note at a time.